Hi, I'm Brad Power, and this is the Cancer Patient Lab. Um, as usual, our disclaimers are two. One, that this is not medical advice. This is for informational purposes only, to give you information you can take to your medical team. And secondly, everything you say can and will be used in public. So if you care about being public, change your name, hide your image, and don't say anything because we will make all of this public. And just a plug for those of you who don't know Cancer Patient Lab, it always encourages me to say we're a learning community of advanced cancer patients trying to learn more about our disease, and what we exist at the kindness of contributors. So we look for contributions. We're patient-led, all volunteer, and so we would appreciate it if you could donate. With that, I'll introduce Samira Daswani. Actually, I met Samira through Molly, who's Samira's partner at Manta Cares. And Molly, I think we met, she coincidentally, for those of you who recall Bryce Olson, Molly was a good friend of Bryce in Portland, Oregon. And so we had that connection, among others. There were many others. I think we actually connected maybe through Cancer X, I'm not sure. But anyway, there were multiple connections. And then Molly introduced me to Samira. And Samira is a quintessential entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, and I think got breast cancer, and in managing her own disease, developed some tools that she made available through Manta Cares. And she'll go into that in more detail. So let me turn it over to Samira.
Thank you so much, Brad, for having us. Molly, jump in anytime. Maybe you want to start with a quick intro before I do mine, and then we can show some slides.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Brad mentioned, we met and had all these wonderful connections. My favorite, of course, being Bryce, who was a dear friend of mine and one of kind of my inspirations. I met him soon after I went through breast cancer treatment about 12 years ago. Two bald heads meet in a park is kind of how we used to joke how we met, and then became very good friends as a result. My professional background is in finance and strategy, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that kind of rejiggered my professional and personal trajectory, and ended up creating a nonprofit crowdfunding platform that I ran for about a decade, and then joined forces with Samira, who I met also through a longtime dear friend. It was one of those, I've just met this amazing breast cancer survivor, you two should talk, and the rest is history, so to speak. So I've joined forces with her to really help improve the patient experience.
I'm Samira. I am a bioengineer by training. I'm an art historian by training, and then ended up at McKinsey & Company for a handful of years in their global health practice, and then switched to startup land. I've been in startups for a very long period of time now, almost all in healthcare, with the one tiny exception of doing a fashion AI company in the middle there, which I don't think is pertinent to this conversation at all. But what happened was I learned the hard way that designing in healthcare is really hard, is really tough, because healthcare is a business in the US, and very often the business sort of takes over. So a lot of times companies, nonprofits, all of the people who want to do good really struggle because we don't have the space to build good products. And I wanted to learn how to do that. So I got a grad degree in design, the intersection of human-centered design and healthcare. I then took a job as the head of product at a medical diagnostic company, where I took a couple of products through the FDA. And that's when I got diagnosed with breast cancer. So Molly and I are about, I keep betting, what, 12 years out, Molly? 10 years out, 12 years out?
Yeah. Ish.
Ish. And I was a couple of weeks out of being 30 when I got diagnosed, found love myself. I went through a lot of the similar things where I got dismissed by the clinicians, and eventually got the diagnosis and ended up in 18 months of active treatment. Early stage breast cancer, knock on wood, prognosis is good, but I skew young, which means, well, I skew young and the data goes out only so far. So in terms of what that means for the future, who knows? But a lot of the work we do at Manta comes initially from my own experiences, but then Molly's experiences and the experience of, honestly, a lot of the team that works at Manta Cares, and then all of the individuals we've had the fortune of intersecting with, because we constantly learn from other patients and family members who are going through their experiences and try and make sure that what we're building is truly in service of them. So that's the background. I would love for this to be interactive, by the way. I told Molly this. I do not like talking about my story, so you guys may have to like nudge a little bit. So that's one fear. And the second fear is I don't think we've ever presented to a group that skews, well, mostly male, and then prostate cancer. And I think a lot of what we learn from has been very heavily influenced by the breast cancer community. Of course, we serve other cancer types. So if we show anything and you're like, hey, that makes no sense, why would you guys do that? Please let us know, because we're always soliciting your opinion, your feedback, your thoughts. We just believe that we're better with each other's opinions in there. So anything we show today, feel free to give us feedback, jump in, comment, critique, etc. Does that work? All right. Okay. So I did prepare slides because Brad suggested we do that. So let's go in there. And of course, I'm going to show you the wrong slide first. Okay. Everyone can see my screen? All right. So our mission is to demystify cancer. And we're playing with the true mission statement here. And we sort of stumbled across this one partly because we began to realize that what we've been building has been truly in the service of enabling patients and family members to know what to expect. So that's sort of the overarching goal of our company, of the products we build, and of the community we serve. I do actually want to start firstly with the macro environment of the business of oncology, because very often in patient groups, we don't talk about the business of oncology enough. And sadly, I do think it affects a lot of our day-to-day lives, whether or not we realize it. So let's maybe spend a couple of minutes on that, and then we can talk about kind of how we bring the patient perspective into it. So if you look at the last 5 years, it's actually a pretty fascinating time to be a patient, because we actually have access today to a hugely large number of cancer drugs. We've doubled the number of cancer treatments available to the patient community in the last 5 years, which I feel very fortunate about, but it can also be incredibly overwhelming to make sure that we're getting the right treatment at the right time. And you're seeing that across the board, where medical information is now doubling at the rate of every 73 days, which means that we're now sitting in a world where we just have information overload constantly and everywhere. And we are having to, and by we, I mean the patient and the family, are having to truly take a different approach than we have in the past. About 70% of patients and family members are self-educating and driving decisions today in oncology. But sadly, the tools we have access to, I think, are not the best, which sometimes does lead to misinformed and uninformed decisions. When we've spoken to the community, we've learned that patients and families come up with their own tools. We use north of 15 DIY tools to self-manage the many, many aspects of the experience. And sometimes that leads to non-adherence of treatment, the wrong protocol for the trial. It's because we're building our own tools and we don't actually have the right tooling to help us across the many aspects of the experience. 53% are lonely and depressed. And yet we see sort of low utilization of support programs that do exist. Is this mismatch of like support programs exist and we can't find them at the right time? And then lastly, in the world of AI and ChatGPT, 25% of the community actually doesn't use digital tools. So we have a large number of individuals in our community who are still largely underserved, because in the world of AI and ChatGPT, well, if they're not on the internet, that doesn't really matter very much. Let me maybe stop here for a second. I'm assuming this resonates to some extent with this group. Does it not? Any thoughts there?
Well, just a quick comment. I'm actually surprised that 70% of people self-educate and make decisions, because in my rough feeling, this is not based on any data, it feels like 50% of people are in denial, and then and so pretend they don't have the disease or don't want to let it define their life or minimize it. And then of those 50%, just of those remaining 50%, 25% are just following their doctor's directions. So it's like they're good patients, meaning they do what their doctor says. And so it only leaves 5 or 10% to be like the community that we have, which is people that are trying to self-educate and kind of come up to speed so that they can be actively engaged in their care. So I don't know, how do you, what's been your experience on that, kind of my take versus the 70% self-educating?
Molly and I had a very similar discussion when we found this paper because it's coming from a shared decision-making paper that was published, I want to say a couple of years ago. And the breakdown here is actually 30% is actually the same number that you're talking about, where patients are sort of the good patients, right? Rely fully on the clinician to make the decision and sort of follow suit. The 70%, the breakdown is about 25% are truly like, I make my own call. I'm the patient, it's my body, I'm driving the decision, full stop. The rest are in the world of quote unquote shared decision making. So to be in the shared decision making world, you do need to do some amount of self-education. The number, Brad, that blew my mind though was it was spoken about at ASCO last year. There is a shared decision making doctor called Dr. Mark Lewis, who had a presentation at ASCO, at the main ASCO Congress. And he shared a number that truly blew my mind. He said 97% of cancer patients and families are using Google to help educate and self-manage the care. 97%. That number, that number really threw me off a little bit, because that's basically everybody, right? That's essentially everybody. And if you look at the last number we have here, which is 25% don't use digital tools, the reality is, while you may not be using digital tools, you still have access to some amount of the internet today. And it's this discrepancy we're sitting in where, and I think that's actually where our work comes in, is very often we meet patients and families at one point in the experience. And at some point there may be denial. I can promise you I've been there. I definitely had denial. I needed someone who sat me down and be like, Samira, you may not have, I mean, I remember this moment. I go to my professor, I had just gotten diagnosed. And I was like, if I have breast cancer, and he looked at me, he's like, it's not an if you have breast cancer, you have breast cancer. You have a diagnosis. And I remember sitting there going like, oh my God, he's right. Like, so I think there is denial, but I suspect that it's transitory. We may not be catching everyone at the points where they are coming to realizations that they need to do something about it. And I think we capture them in one moment and then assume we know the full experience. Anyway, that's the way I rationalize the numbers anyway.
I just want to build on what you said. Oh, I'll let Brian. I just quickly, I think I heard somewhere that somewhere between 10 and 20% of Google searches are on health-related information, which is also mind blower considering the huge volume that they have of searches. And then I was just talking with Frank Nothaff this week about, and what would AI and a generative AI do to that? So you're not searching for answers to questions, but you're just asking a question of a chat bot that's tied to something.
Yes.
And then related to that, on the misinformed and uninformed, you've got a typo there, by the way, I just noticed. Uniformed. I talked to someone at Google about YouTube, and YouTube is having to, you kind of delete all the misinformation. And by the time they delete it all, it's a desert because there's so much misinformation. Like, the majority of stuff that's posted is bad. So YouTube is really struggling to find reliable content. And that's where we feel like we could make a contribution with some of the sessions like this by posting them. I'm sorry, Brian.
Yeah, so my question really revolves around the trajectory of these numbers and how the typical patriarchal decision making is changing, right? So 70% are self-educated to make decisions. What did that look like 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Is it, and because that's important in terms of how we think about our community and helping to educate them, and the reception on the other side of the clinician to accept that collaborative type of relationship with the patient.
I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I can only give you anecdotes on it, Brian, because I'm with you on the trend line. I think the trend line matters probably more than the static case today. We were in conversation with the founder of a very, very successful consumer-facing healthcare brand. And this individual was telling me that they do a lot of direct-to-consumer, not oncology, but direct-to-consumer work with patients. And this individual was telling me that today, their marketing efforts have completely changed than about 7 years ago. There's been a drastic change, and the drastic change is primarily being driven by an immense amount of distrust of the system. That we're sitting in a world where the amount of distrust there is in the healthcare system is unprecedented. And when we look at it, I don't know if oncology is also different, right? I think the relationship with a cancer specialist is different than a primary care doc. I think there is, I don't know if we should take that as sort of fact. Yeah. But I do suspect that some amount of that is true, because what's the first thing we do when you get a report back? At least I go to Google immediately. That is the very first thing I do. If I get my mammo results back, the very first thing I'm doing is like scanning, looking at the BI-RADS score and going straight to Google. Because the reality is you get your report before you talk to the oncologist. The odds are your oncologist meeting is 2 weeks out. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of moment of panic of like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And sadly, or not sadly, just the reality of healthcare is we don't have that many oncologists. And I'm forgetting what the number is. I think what was it? I think it was like maybe, don't quote me on this, but I think it's like a double-digit number of oncologists are retiring. And when you look at the demand for oncology, the projected demand is supposed to rise by 40% in the next 5 years. And we are already in a short supply of oncologists, and that number is going to keep growing, right? So the demand supply curve on this is just unfortunately not skewed to enable patients and families to get more time with the people who know this the best.
Yeah.
So it's
well, the system.
a little dark.
I know you need to keep moving, but you know, results of tests, for example, and imaging, all pathology, these can be published on, you know, a patient portal, and there could be absolutely no explanation. And so, of course, it forces the patient or encourages the patient to do their own level of self-educating, and that can be that information can be wildly misinterpreted, or the information that's actually presented on the report can be wrong.
Yes.
Which just happened to me.
Oh.
Yeah. We'll save it for another time.
Well, I just want to chime in with 2 examples in this space that I've just had recently in my experience. One is, this is a great use case for ChatGPT. If you take the pathology report, which is inscrutable to humans, except for Alan, it's got a whole bunch of medical terms. I don't even know what some of these anatomical names are, where that like things are lighting up and they're explaining things. But you run it through ChatGPT and say, put it in, 8th grade English, and it all becomes interpretable. But even beyond that, there's an interpretation level, which many people on this call have taken advantage of, which is how does this relate to expectations? So, is this good or bad? That's really what you want to know. Is this something I should be worried about or not? And that only comes, I think, ChatGPT and tests are never going to tell you that. And that's what you get from your doctor. But again, you're waiting. So we have taken advantage of Cancer Commons, and we have, direct lines to Emma Stivelman, who's a goddess. And she, on 2 occasions, said, "This report tells me that you're on track." And that was like huge. And in another case, and I haven't told Brian and others this, but I got a proteomics report, which we can get through MProbe. And I got this report back, said there are 3 chemotherapies you're indicated to get. And I said, well, that's interesting. And then Emma looked at it and said, well, it turns out proteomics is great in solid tumors, but has no experience in liquid tumors. Disregard all of that. Oh my God. I mean, it's sort of similar to Brian's. Just throw it out. So, it's amazing. There's still this value added layer that you need from the people that have seen 100 cases and can tell you, is this good or is this bad? Or should you, or is it wrong?
Maybe I can quickly respond to that, Brad, with two comments in there, because I'm completely with you. I spend a lot of time on PubMed and Google Scholar. I think for me, like I tapped out of Google search very quickly, but most of my time was in the rabbit hole of PubMed and Google Scholar. And the big thing I have learned, and I did not learn this when I was in active treatment, I have learned recently, because we have a podcast. The podcast is called The Patient from Hell. And on the podcast, we've gotten a grant from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And part of that grant is to have researchers and clinicians to come on and talk about research that has been funded and sponsored in oncology by PCORI. And in the process of doing that, what we do for the podcast is we go through papers. We look at the paper, prepare it, I ask a bunch of questions, the clinician or the researcher will respond. And my big learning has been, I'm a scientist, worked in healthcare. I'm like, I can read papers. Like, of course, I feel comfortable. And the big thing I've learned is medicine and information is moving so quickly that research published 5 years ago may be completely irrelevant today. And in conversation with these researchers, it blows my mind, because you're looking at studies that were done 2020, 2019. And in conversations that explore the results of this are basically irrelevant. We did the study, and since that study was published, we've done all this other work that has either proven it, disproven it, missed the contextualization of it. So it's been this like fascinating shift of, the question is, who is the one to give you the value added layer, right? Is it really a clinician? Is it a scientist? Is it a researcher? I'm not sure it's the clinician, because I'm not sure the clinicians are able to keep up to speed with the change of information. I'm actually not sure. I want them to. Trust me, I want my oncologist to have read every single paper that came out in my case. But if I look at their schedule, my heart goes out to them. Their schedules are bad. They're really bad. They're barely managing to keep up with their schedules. And I think the expectation that they have kept up to speed with it, I think is maybe too great an expectation. But anyway, that's my two takes on it.
And unfortunately, there is, as people are looking, more widespread evidence of data manipulation in very well respected research institutions by some teams. So, and there's no way to, for us anyway, to know that.
Yes.
I think, and that, Jeff, exactly to the earlier point, just feeds the distrust, right? Because you don't know who to turn to. You don't even know if these published, statistics are accurate. So it's this kind of constant chicken egg situation of where do you turn? I see too, David, you have your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that I'm a member of several different prostate cancer support groups on Facebook, and I'm seeing a real increase in the number of people, especially new patients, who are posting screenshots from their patient portal or their reports with really plaintive questions of, what does this mean? Is this good? Is this bad? They don't know who to ask. They don't know where to ask. And so they're asking in a form where they're getting a lot of poorly presented ideas and opinions, and sometimes some actual information, but there's no way to filter it or judge it. So they're getting overwhelmed with what could be good advice, what could be bad advice, and they don't know where to go.
Definitely agree with that. I've definitely done that as part of the breast cancer community I was part of. I was part of a young breast cancer Bay Area community, and David, it was exactly the same thing in there. And it hit a point where you, as a patient, I don't know if you feel this way, but as a patient, you actually, the question is, who do you trust? And do you trust your clinician, who at some point may or may not have read the paper? Do you trust a fellow survivor who's just gone through it, who may or may not have the specific type of cancer you have? Do you trust Google, where you really have to contextualize it yourself? Do you trust your interpretation of a PubMed article or a Google Scholar article? I don't know. I don't think we have a good answer yet, but that's a problem for yourself. So hopefully you can solve it.
I haven't reached the point where I trust the AI interpretations yet. So I'm always looking for the source, but I have the time and the interest to go look at the various sources, and a lot of people that are no more sophisticated in their technical skills than looking at Facebook. They just don't know how to do that.
You and I are on the same page on that one. I'm completely with you on the trust or lack thereof on AI tools.
Alan has his hand raised, and Alan, I was thinking you might be the best person to comment on keeping up, since you must have to be more.
I am going to talk about that, but I did want to say something before I forgot. So you're talking to a prostate cancer group, and you thought that may be alien to you since you're breast cancer. I just wanted to tell you that of all solid cancers, breast cancer and prostate cancer are the most similar. This is a tangential history factoid. Breast cancer research and probably antedated prostate cancer research by about 3 decades. And it inspired a guy named Michael Milken to develop the Prostate Cancer Foundation. And he looked to breast cancer as his yellow brick road to how to do things. He was doing this in the 90s when prostate cancer only had one tool in the toolbox, which was basically Lupron, luteinizing releasing hormone agonist. And now there's at least 7 different classes. And now to jump ahead to keeping up, you are absolutely right that it is going exponential. It's going exponential like I've never seen, of course, but let me tell you, the NCCN guidelines, which are the Bible, they would publish, I have the book right here. It's my Bible. It's the 8th edition. They would publish it maybe, when I started, every 5 years, then it got every 4 years, then it was every 3 years, then it was every 2 years. This 8th edition was after the 7th edition, 2 years. So I'm pounding the table to my people. Hey, we need to get the 9th edition. They keep saying it's there. Well, there is no 9th edition anymore. It's online and anybody can get to it. And it's exponential, and testament to it is that there's no longer a book published. It's called the AJCC Cancer Staging Manual. It's right in front of me because it's always at arm's length for me because I cannot memorize all the different stuff that goes into each cancer. So I think I'm answering your question. When you say nobody can keep up, if you want to just go with the NCCN, nobody can keep up with the frontier. Certainly nobody can keep up with phase 2 studies that are promising. Nobody can keep up with that except for specialists in the particular area. Like if you're a triple negative breast cancer expert at Stanford University, and you're designing the studies, you can keep up with that phase 2 stuff because you're the one designing those studies. But for the 99% of physicians, and I'm talking about oncologists who are not clinician scientists, they can keep up, but just with phase 3 stuff and phase 3 stuff per what's in the NCCN guidelines. And everybody, including us, can look up the NCCN guidelines, and they're updated on a continuous basis. Did that make any sense?
Tons of sense. Trust me, I have read the full NCCN guidelines for my type of cancer. You're completely right, Alan. And I want a world in which clinicians are able to do that all the time. Right. And my question is, how often in the community setting is the oncologist actually looking up NCCN guidelines? And
all the time. They're looking it up all the time. And they'll admit for like all these cancers, like myeloma, there would take forever to memorize them, but they don't have to memorize them. All they have to do is say, oh, this is my myeloma patient. They have these adverse factors, like they're anemic, or they have a high beta globulin, or they have this or that. And then they look up and they see what the branch points are in the NCCN guidelines. And they walk around with their computers. When I'm talking to all the clinicians now, they have their laptop right in their hands.
Yeah. And I've seen them, they use their app as well. I have seen clinicians pull up their NCCN app and look it up as well, because there is an NCCN app. And if you have an FBI number, you can log in and do it. And I'm completely sold. I'm not suggesting that there are not tools available to clinicians. I'm suggesting that we are in a world where we have to rely on tools.
Yes. Yeah. Now, admittedly, this crew is interested in what I would call what's immediately in the frontier, which is within 6 months, and that would be fast track phase 2 stuff. They're also interested in what's intermediate. All that stuff, 99% of clinicians who are not clinician scientists are going to know nothing about that, because it's hard enough to keep up with the phase 3 stuff. So I make that admission to you. But as far as the phase 3 stuff, they can type it in their computers and get it up like that.
I think that's completely true, Alan, and I think you said something really, really important, and I'm cognizant of time here, so I'm going to say this one thing and then maybe try and show you guys a couple more slides. I think, and again, this is an opinion and not necessarily a fact, but what we've learned from the patient community is, I think we sort of fall into 2 very different camps. There is the early stage camps where guidelines really is the Bible, right? Where guidelines have enough of confidence level, there's enough of a data set there that getting treated by guidelines, by standard of care, is what you need to do. Then we have the subset of patients where that necessarily may not be what you should be doing, right? Rarer types of cancers, where the body of evidence is still small, where, to the point you're making, like trials that we are looking at maybe in phase 2 trials may not have hit phase 3 trials, where guidelines are not there yet because the body of evidence is still being generated. Right. And the tools we need for those 2 sets of patients and clinicians are actually different. Right. And we need to enable both sets to get to what they need to get to, because of the point you're making. Right. Guidelines, I believe, is super important. And like guideline-based care is essential for us to get anywhere for standardization of outcomes across different populations. I'm a full believer in that, in the settings where the evidence exists. Right. So I think for me, it's the context of the evidence exists. And what I'm hearing from you is where evidence is being generated, guidelines have a natural limitation, because a guideline doesn't come into existence unless there is an evidence body. So it's, I don't know, I think we're living in as a patient, you sometimes are in one group and sometimes you're in the other group, and you're kind of like fluctuating, especially I'm seeing a couple of heads nod in the group here. I'm imagining in the advanced state settings, or anytime you're an outlier, right? Anytime the study wasn't done to include your type of cancer, or your type of demographic, or your type of submolecular type, anytime you're an outlier, I think it becomes a much harder experience to navigate to some extent, because guidelines simply don't support that subcohort. Anyway, with that said, I'm not seeing any reaction, so I'll take that as non-disagreement. I'm going to skip this. You guys, I know the story already. We just show this slide because it's a picture from May of 2020. My family shows up. I am eternally grateful for my family to come and take care of me. Honestly, without them, I don't think I would have had the prognosis I had, nor would I have had the support I had. So a lot of the work is not just about us. It's about the family members that surround us, and the community that surrounds us, and the friends that surround us. And very often in the patient community, we kind of get locked into patient first. And this slide is mostly to say that it's not just about us. The company actually started in a very non-tech place, given all the conversation we've had about apps and AI and tools. We started with a paper product. Most often, women buy it. I will say that. We just have 70% of our population that buys the paper product is female. So I'm happy to show it to you guys and see if it's of any value to you all. It came from a lot of the first experiences that I had when going through treatment. I got pretty frustrated because there weren't tools for patients. There are tools for clinicians, but there aren't that many tools for patients. And I can't remember the last time I have been in a meeting where I didn't have an appointment, like a note-taking tool, except in my healthcare appointments. So part of this was just trying to get some control back for myself. It's a small product. It's got no cancer branding on it. It can fit in your bag, a purse. It's very lightweight. It is a structured appointment notebook. So it's not a blank rule book. That's not a word. Ruled notebook is what I was trying to say. It has structures that reminds you to like write your symptoms down, note your questions for your doc. What is the motivation for the appointment? What's the goal you're trying to get to? This template of ours gets a lot of positive feedback from both patients and families. We've come up with a sort of 2-panel template to capture everything that might happen in the course of a day, right? So all of the emotional stuff, there's tons of data around gratitude log, hope logs as a way to like ground people on the emotional side. All the obvious things to track. And yes, I know there's a typo in my exercise spelling, which has obviously been fixed in the print version, but you will see it in my slideshow here. And then on the right side, it actually comes from a lot of Dr. Ethan Bash's work on PROs and symptom tracking. And sometimes paper actually still works. So we've just created a simple tool to help patients keep track of their symptoms and then medication and nutrition. The book is pretty lightweight on content. It actually goes back to the point where there's a lot of information out there and we're not trying to recreate the wheel in any way, shape, or form. But sometimes when you're in the appointment, you have a deer in headlight moment. And we've created 1 or 2 pages of content in the planner itself to rescue you if you end up in a deer in headlight moment. The book, from a branding perspective, you'll see the cancer word is almost never used, because it allows patients and families using the product to put it and take it with them and not have to reveal or disclose that they are going through cancer, which we learned from experimentation was really important. Because very often, and this is where I don't know the prostate cancer community, but in the breast cancer community, very often the tools you get or the support you get has the pink ribbon on it, it has the bald head on it, and all good, but when you carry it around, it's a public disclosure of your disease, which we believe should be optional and not mandatory. So that's why the product is branded the way it's branded. And the last picture I'll show you is we've purposely kept it kind of high level. So if you did want to brand it with whatever motivates you, you'll see that we have users who, color it, sticker it, make it their own, because there's plenty of space to make it your own. What we learned, actually, before I go to the next one, what we've learned, paper product came out in 2021. We've helped a couple of thousand patients with it. Hospitals buy it from us, patient advocacy communities buy it from us and give it away to patients. It is available for sale on Amazon and our website. But the biggest point I was going to make is what we've learned with the paper product is patients and families describe the experience in a very similar fashion across cancer types. So this is where I'm going to leave the breast cancer world and kind of go pan cancer for a second. What we have learned is patients and families describe it like a treacherous hike where you do not get access to a map, you don't get access to relevant gear, and you don't get access to a guide. And a key part of that statement is you don't get access to a map. So a few years ago, we found a cartographer and met our now chief medical officer, who's Dr. Doug Blaney. He's a former ASCO president. He's been on multiple NCCN guideline committees. He was a Stanford breast oncologist, ran the cancer center for a while. He's our CMO. And in partnership with him, we've been building maps. So we started with breast, we're working on lung, and we've actually started our prostate cancer map. So I am not familiar with advanced stage prostate cancer, but I am getting familiar with early stage prostate cancer right now through our process of making maps. Our tool has not been launched, the digital tool. The goal is to launch in the back half of this year. When we say map, we quite literally mean map, by the way. Think New York City subway map, but for your disease. It reflects guidelines, clinical practice, especially when they do not align, because there are moments in time where they don't align, and the patient and family experience. Because very often patient preference and family preferences sometimes don't show up in the guidelines. So we make sure that our maps are sort of bridging all 3 worlds and merging them into one interface. The goal of our map really is to give you the right information at the right times, to enable you to get to the self-management tools and templates, to access on-demand support. And by support here, we don't mean clinician support. We believe very strongly that decision-making needs to stay between the clinician and the patient and the family. What we mean here is all the ancillary support that goes around the clinician, right? Access to qualified nutritionists, access to qualified lymphedema specialists, access to mental health therapists, peer navigators, groups like yourself. So creating a place where we can connect the patient to the right support at the right time. And then, of course, a paper product to make sure that all of the tools that we provide are truly equitable to ensure that we meet any patient anywhere in the country where they are with access to whatever resources they have access to. Our digital product is not, as I mentioned, not available yet, which is why we're giving a very lightweight version of it. We have been testing it a lot, and what we have seen is both oncologists, nurses really want to use it. They want to recommend it. They believe it'll keep people from spiraling out of control on Google, which is part of the conversation we just had. And then more importantly, patients and survivors really love it. We've had plenty of patients who've looked at it and basically asked us, can I get access by next week, please? I have an appointment coming up. And we're like, well, yes, in a few months is our current answer to it. We actually don't need a lot of information from you to give you a map. We're actually kind of a funny little creature in that we don't need medical record information. We don't need EMR integration. We do need you to know what your diagnosis is, which we believe will skew to patients who know the diagnosis. But if you know your diagnosis, we can give you a representative map that is accurate for your diagnosis. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we have a podcast. It's called The Patient from Hell. You can listen to it on any podcasting channel. The podcast is funded by a part of the podcast. A subset of episodes are funded by the Picori Foundation with a grant. And the really nice thing is about 65% of our audience does skew to the older demographic. I only say that because most podcasts don't have that. And for us, it's an indication that we are reaching the audiences that we want to reach. And this is the last slide we have. You can learn more about us on our website. Our website is only reflective of the work we are public about today, which is the podcast and the planner. And then if you're interested in learning more about the digital product, we're happy to show it to you and learn from you and see if there are opportunities to collaborate. That's all the slides I have. And then we can keep talking.
Great. So as usual, we'll use the raise hand feature for discussion. So if people have questions or comments. I was remembering from the mapping part, Samir, I had mentioned to you that Rick Stanton did some work with turning the NCCN guidelines into a decision tree. Alan had mentioned something similar. They don't naturally lay out like, here's a fork in the road and here's how you decide on which fork you take. It's not really mapped out that way. Can you sort of say how your maps are different from what you might see in the NCCN guidelines? Because I think there's that dimension of actually making it a map. But
Yes.
then there's also, I think you're including a lot of quality of life and other factors. The NCCN guidelines are only going to be medical. And it sounds like, I'm guessing you would be including a lot of other criteria and questions and things that people would be worried about.
Yes, so let's maybe talk a bit about our maps, and then maybe I can come back to guidelines, how they're
I
different.
forgot I have a cancer webinar that I'm on right now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
What's up?
I won't be here tonight.
Okay.
It's an hour.
I just muted that. Sorry, go ahead.
So all of our maps typically have 3 zones. There's a zone for diagnosis, a zone for treatment, and a zone for living with your condition. If you look at guidelines, guidelines are great at diagnosis and treatment. On living with the condition, they tend to be pretty light. And for us, living with the condition is really dependent on the condition, right? Even if you look at breast cancer, if you have a DCIS diagnosis versus a metastatic breast cancer diagnosis, what you're living with is very different, right? Because in one type of cancer, you're exploring palliative care, you're exploring hospice care, you might be thinking about end-of-life stuff, whereas in the early stage settings, maybe you're not. So our living with zone is also disease dependent, and that is probably the biggest deviation from deviation. I shouldn't say deviation, it's not a deviation, it's where we add more value than so just clinician-facing guidelines are. That's one. The second area is guidelines today, and I'm talking now about the patient-facing guidelines. I'm a huge fan of NCCN's patient-facing guidelines. I've used them, as I mentioned, I've read every paragraph in them and reread them many times for my own care. They aren't written at the 7th grade reading level. And going back to, I think, something you said, Brad, where you're using ChatGPT to put in your path report and get a 8th grade reading level assessment of it, all of our content that we curate is at the 7th grade reading level. And I think that's a very, very important point, because going back to one of the things we spoke about early, contextualizing information is really essential. The third area where I think we're a little different than guidelines and clinical pathways, I should say, because from a clinician perspective, there's also clinical pathways. If you're in a system that uses clinical pathways, is we're not talking about training the clinician, right? This is not a clinician-facing tool. It's a patient-facing tool and a caregiver-facing tool. And ensuring that it's easy to use is very important, because we've tested flowcharts. So you could just do a flowchart and be like, hey, here's a flowchart. And what we have learned is flowcharts are great for engineers like me. I love flowcharts. I'll happily look at flowchart any day, anytime. But that necessarily doesn't translate to everybody who's going through it, right? If you're not an engineer, if you're not a scientist, flowcharts can be really intimidating. And we've tried to find design principles that come from closer to everyday life that we are used to using, right? So if you look at navigation systems, Google Maps, subway system maps, things that most of us have used at some point in our lives, we're drawing a lot of design inspiration from there, because making sure it's truly usable is a very important feature, at least for our product. So that's kind of where I would say we are trying to add more value than just taking, say, guidelines and making it a flowchart. So
Great. Can you turn off screen share? And then Brian has a question.
Yeah, excuse me. So Samir, I want to get back to something that you said earlier and just provide kind of case study on this, which is like, who do you trust? And do you trust the clinician? Do you trust the scientist, the bioinformatician, or fellow patients? And what I'm seeing is that as the pace of bioinformatics is accelerating, first it was limited gene panel DNA, then you're getting into transcriptomics. We talked about proteomics. I had spatial phenotyping done. There's a lot of things that are coming our way. And what happened in my case is that through a really extensive multi-omic analysis that Boston Gene did, where they did DNA, they did all these things, right? It sort of redefined my disease, which is really what we want, right? Which is say, I don't just have prostate cancer, and I don't just have these 3 gene mutations. I actually have, my transcriptomics shows that I've got potentially subclones that are neuroendocrine. And when validating that information, which I did through a really talented bioinformatician at UC San Diego, a scientist who's a friend of Cancer Commons, or sorry, a friend of Cancer Patient Lab, their advice was, stay away from treatments that are going to fuel the fire of neuroendocrine disease. But when I spoke to 2 clinicians, they were reticent to just simply say, hey, your disease is now neuroendocrine and we're going to treat it as such. So this is just sort of like an example of this probably growing trend of distance between what's happening with bioinformatics and what clinicians can actually keep up with, and the patient is stuck in the middle. Who do we believe, and how do we treat that? And my guess is that as more patients get access to this type of information, that these types of problems will become more commonplace.
Brian, I can't tell you how often we hear the story you just gave or a variation thereof. Just in the last week, I probably heard 4 or 5 patients with that.
Hmm.
And not just prostate cancer. I'm talking every pick your flavor of oncology. I'm completely with you. I am fully with you, which is why I think we are trying to bridge the gap between guideline, science, clinical practice, and patient experience. Because if you look at those 3 things independently, they're actually very different. Like let's take lung cancer, right? In lung cancer, we're living in a world where we have 45 targeted therapies today. 45. They're all contingent on you having done next generation sequencing. All of them. You have to have done next gen for you to get the report, for you to then drive a decision. The question is, how often are clinicians ordering NGS? How often are they using what they have ordered in the right time to drive the treatment? Right? And I don't think that's clinicians don't know NGS. Of course they know NGS has been around for a long time, right? But part of the issue is the operationalization of it, right? Like NGS takes 10 days to 4 weeks to come back. And if a patient shows up and they have a high symptom burden, and the patient is saying, hey, I want to start treatment ASAP, maybe the clinician's going to start you on chemo and not wait for NGS, right? And that's an example where we have guidelines. Guidelines say do NGS first. Clinician may be following guidelines. Clinical practice patterns and operations may not have kept up to speed with it. And now we're sitting in a world where the treatment you've gotten may not be the right treatment for your actual disease, right? So it's so complicated. And we really try with our maps to merge those things and show the branch points, because the reality is sometimes decisions are being made because there are trade-offs that are happening, even if the clinician has ordered the test and I don't know, the lab is backed up, or prior auth hasn't come in, or the appointment got moved, right? It's just like
there are a lot of challenges. Tissue is a big issue, right? You know, how readily available is it? Some of the analysis that was done on me was based on tissue from November 2022. Well, I've had several different systemic therapies since then. My cancer's changed. And does it even look more like neuroendocrine, or does it look less? I don't know, right? Anyway, it's a fascinating time to be in this space. These are great problems to solve. Glad you're on it. But they're really important challenges that we've got to get addressed.
Samir, I just want to point out that I think that what Brian's pointing out is an order of magnitude more complex than the example you gave, which is he has gotten transcriptomics, proteomics, and he's got longitudinal multiple NGSs, and those things can be concordant or they can be conflicting. And he's got heterogeneity as another variable. And so the combinations and permutations are going to blow your attempt to put it. I mean, the example you were giving, I can put that, if you have ALK positive in lung cancer, then here's the drug for you. That is kind of like binary.
Yep.
What he's getting at is like, no, I do have that, and I have that, and I have that, and I have that. I've got a BRCA, I've got a HER2, I've got a this, and I've got a that. And now what do you do? And I got a little bit of disagreement between some of the tests. Anyway, the point is, at a population health level, which is where the NCCN guidelines live, you can kind of make it logical, rational, and it's like if then else. You can like go down the whole chain. What he's getting at is like N of 1. And now it's like, okay, I'm starting with Brian, and now I'm trying to decipher that riddle. And it's like I think it's an order of magnitude more complex. And I think it will, for those kind of cases, it's going to make your mapping very like I don't know, I was going to say, and like that old map that says, "And there be dragons." I don't know. It's like like it's going to be like, okay, in this zone, you got to go to a completely different logic.
No, actually, Brad, what you just said is exactly what we do. Actually, what you just said is super, super important. And it's actually exactly what we do. And because if you I'm going to stick with the NGS example. There's a reason I went there, is because the most common scenarios, you have one mutation. But in the outlier scenario, you may have multiples. you may have started with EGFR 19 and that's gotten now changed to, I don't know, ALK rearrangement or ROS1 and HER2, right? So from a clinical guideline perspective, it doesn't actually capture the nuance. But that's where our map making actually tries to capture the disease biology, right? So the principles of map making we've come up with are closer to the biology of the disease versus guidelines. And that's how we're able to like merge them. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to. We really would not be able to, right? And just to be clear, our map is at the disease level. It's not at Brian's level, right? So we're saying, hey, here's the disease map. Here's a tool for you. You then need to like figure out which path you're going on, because there's no way we will be able to tell you your map. Because I think if we tried your map, maybe in the future, maybe I don't know, at some point in the future we can get there, but not right now. Right now, I am mostly just humbled by the complexity of these diseases and how different they are. Because I can tell you that our early stage breast cancer map and our metastatic breast cancer map look completely different. They are totally different diseases. Right? Because in early stage setting, you're not dealing with heterogeneity. You're not dealing with mutagenic shift. You're not dealing with which tumor sample did you use and how long ago was your test done, right? Because to the point Brian made, if your tumor sample is in 2020 and since 2022, and since then you've had systemic treatment, and now we're using that report today, you know, that has its own drawbacks in there. So anyway.
Minding the time, we're at the hour. Do you have a few more minutes or should we wrap?
I can probably go for another 5-ish minutes. I just need to, I can probably go another 5 minutes.
Okay. Mark, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, this is very interesting, very helpful, and great presentation by Samara, just to kind of meet the group and understand this perspective. Just kind of outside the discussion of what was just covered, but 10 days ago, I had my 5th treatment and infusion. I go UCSF in San Francisco. I have great health insurance, but I saw the bill, $76,000. It was for 6.5 hours of treatment, and it lists all the drugs that were given to me. They rotate the bags, the pills, et cetera, et cetera. It's just incredible, the cost. $76,000 for the treatment. So just kind of an aside from an add-on kind of to the last discussion.
So building on that, do you incorporate those sorts of considerations in your maps?
We do. There's we do it at 2, maybe 3 levels actually. When we're building the map, you sort of a priori know because we work with clinicians to build the map, right? So we're closely partnering with the key opinion leaders in that specific disease area to build the map. So we make sure the maps are gotten like the seal of approval from a set of clinicians. And in the process of doing that, from their experiences, we sort of know whether, especially the big tripwires come with prior auth, where insurance may or may not cover it. Genetic testing is a great example in breast cancer, right? Because in breast cancer, sometimes based on your plan, it might not be covered, right? The full panel may not covered, a sub panel may be covered, etc. So we actually call that out in the map, being like, you should confirm. 2, if it is not covered, then you should be reaching out to the diagnostic test provider, right? Because very often they have financial support programs in place. And we do the same thing on the drug side. So we try our best. The reality is we're not going to be able to solve financial toxicity through our product, at least not today. But we try our best to highlight areas we know a priori that there are going to be problems. Because
I would just
go ahead, Molly.
Oh, I would just tag on to that. And then we partner with organizations that are experts in it so that we can at least get people to, places that can potentially help them. And that's part of it too, is our goal is never to recreate the wheel. If there are organizations doing really great work in areas, we want people to know about them. Because often I know for myself personally, I'm like, I would have loved to have known about this, when I was going through chemo, or you often are finding out the information too late. So again, just getting it in front of people and making them aware of the questions to ask, I think is really one of the key goals of the map.
I see Rick is ready with his guitar to sing us out. No, he probably has a question, or what is it?
Yeah, So great presentation. Thank you so much. A suggestion for next time. Please show an example of what your value is. So I've heard the description of your value, and I understand that description, but showing an example of your value, I don't know what this map looks like. Really, how would I use it? How would I benefit from it?
Yes.
I've created maps. So of course I'm an electrical engineer, then went into bioinformatics. So of course I'm interested in, ooh, what's your map look like, right? You know, well, I still don't know. And you can accommodate trajectories from snapshots of maps will change, you know, so, you know, the trajectory of where your disease is going, I don't think is unsolvable. We can do it. So anyway, to wrap up my little monologue, please show an example. Like, hey, here's an example of this patient. Boom, here's where they are. Here's where they benefited. That would be super helpful for next time.
All right, done. Next time we will do that. If you guys want us back, we will happily do that the next time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we a demo of the product. You said it's going to be like in the fall. You'll be releasing.
Yeah, we have demos ready just because we're publicly recording it. We're not ready to show it to the full giant world yet. We're still in testing phase. So that's the only reason why you have not seen the demo yet. But Rick, if you want to get a sneak peek, let us know. We're happy to show it to you and learn from you, by the way. Because I can sense a fellow cartographer in the room. So but I'm not a cartographer. We have a cartographer, but you know.
Great. Well, I want to thank you. We'll wrap up here. And thanks very much.